All right, so a couple of days ago, we got the official results out of Chile, where voters overwhelmingly decided to vote against a proposed new constitution that was intended to replace the previous constitution that was basically enacted under the far-right US-backed dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet that was put in place after the United States aided and abetted in a coup against the left-wing Allende government back in the 70s. So I wanted to get into some of the details in terms of what was actually in this constitution, why some people may have voted against it, as well as what is going to actually take place from here on out in order to try to basically push for a new constitution to replace the one that was just rejected by the voters. So here from the New York Times, they give us a little bit of a breakdown. They say, Chile says no to left-leaning constitution after 3 years of debate. So they say for the past 3 years, Chileans have fought over a path forward for their country in the form of a new constitution written entirely from scratch that would transform their society and grant more rights than any national charter before it. And they say on Sunday, voters overwhelmingly rejected that text. And they say the proposed changes had looked to remake one of the most conservative countries in Latin America into one of the world's most left-leaning societies. But Chileans decided that that went too far. I think that there were some other factors here that played into this beyond just Chilean people deciding that this constitution was like too radical or too left-wing for them. There was a lot of other components that went into this, including massive spending by right-wing factions and propagandists within Chile that basically misled a lot of voters in terms of what was actually in this constitution. But they say that with virtually all of the ballots counted, 62% of voters rejected the proposal. So they say that President Gabriel Boric said in an address to the nation on Sunday night that starting on Monday, he would meet with the leaders of Congress to begin a new process towards a rewritten constitution. So it's not, the end of the road here. It's not as if this was the final step. They're just going to go back to the drawing board and maybe make some compromises on certain aspects of the constitution, and then they're going to put it up for another vote in the near future. So now a little bit of information in terms of what was actually in this constitution, because this was, at least as far as I can tell, pretty based, okay? It was based as fuck all around. It enshrined tons of new rights into Chile that would have made it literally one of the most, if not the single most progressive constitutions in the entire world. So they give us a little bit of information on that, saying that Chilean voters rejected a 170-page 388 article proposal that would have legalized abortion, mandated universal health care, required gender parity in government, meaning you have to have, somewhat close to equal representation between men and women in government. It would also give indigenous groups greater autonomy, empowered labor unions, strengthened regulations on mining, and granted rights to nature and animals. In total, it would have enshrined over 100 rights into Chile's national charter, more than any other constitution in the world, including the right to housing, education, clean air, water, food, sanitation, internet access, retirement benefits, free legal advice and care from birth to death. So this is literally a constitution that I would support being enacted here in the United States, right? If I could draw up a constitution, it would probably be looking somewhat similar to this. So on that front, it seems like it was absolutely based as fuck, and hopefully when they're going back to the drawing board, they don't have to, override a lot of these provisions that were within this. But they say that it would have also eliminated the Senate, strengthened regional governments, and allowed Chilean presidents to run for a second consecutive term. And the text included commitments to fight climate change and protect Chileans' right to choose their own identity, quote, in all its dimensions and manifestations, including sexual characteristics, gender identities, and expressions. So not only, a pretty left-wing constitution on the economic side of this, but also on the culture side of this. But they say that the proposal's sweeping ambition and decidedly leftist slant apparently turned off many Chileans, including many who had previously voted to replace the current text, and there was widespread uncertainty about its implications and costs. Again, a lot of that driven by straight-up misinformation that was led by right-wing factions within Chile and around the world, including here in the United States, and we're going to get to an article on that here in a second. But they say some of which was, of course, as I just said, fueled by misleading information, including claims that it would have banned home ownership and that abortion would have been allowed in the 9th month of pregnancy. So again, you had a lot of reactionaries within Chile who were straight up lying about this constitution and what it would have entailed, basically just trying to push their right-wing ideology to make sure that people were scared about this radical change within the country and wouldn't actually go and vote in favor of it. So now I want to get into a little bit of the propaganda. This piece is not from Chile, but it's from here in the United States, unironically from the Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post. Post, okay, this news outlet that is owned by one of, if not the single wealthiest men on the planet, who of course has a vested interest in making sure that the United States continues to be a global imperial power that has the ability to exploit countries' labor forces and exploit their resources with near impunity, which is exactly what this article outlines as an argument to reject the Constitution. So this was written on August 31st, 2022, so before the actual votes were taking place. They say here from, again, the Washington Post, Chile should send back its proposed constitution for a rewrite. So what are they talking about here? Well, they say that lithium is a key input in batteries that run millions of laptops and upon which the United States is basing its electrified automotive future. Chile sits atop the world's largest lithium reserves, and it produced about 25% of the world's commercial supply in 2020. That's reason enough to pay attention to Chile's impending September 4th referendum on a proposed new constitution. It could recast the legal framework for mining in the South American nation, which has an 18-year-old free trade agreement with the United States. And less tangible, but no less important, the political development of Chile has long been connected with the fate of democracy globally, and then they continue on and on. But clearly the main focus of this is on the lithium reserves within Chile, which kind of reminds me of that old tweet thread from a couple of years ago with Elon Musk. And basically it was some leftist on Twitter replied to him and was accusing him of being in favor of the coup that happened in Bolivia, who also just so happens to have significant lithium reserves as well. And it was a US-backed coup, and basically Elon Musk replied on Twitter saying, "We will coup whoever we want," right? So you're talking about, the extraction industry. As far as I know, this constitution would have guaranteed more protections and rights for like indigenous people and protections for their lands and less exploitation in regards to the mining industry. It wouldn't have completely and fully nationalized it. It would have definitely brought it more under government control in terms of like regulations and authority and having more of a say in terms of how these mining projects will impact the environment, etc. So definitely would have been more of like a left-wing approach to mining and extraction within this country. But of course that is going to absolutely terrify US capitalists. Everybody from Elon Musk talking about Bolivia to now the Jeff Bezos owned Washington Post talking about Chile. So this is part of the reason why there was a lot of misinformation surrounding this constitution, why a lot of right-wing reactionaries, not only in Chile but also around the world, especially here in the United States, had such a strong opinion about what people should do and how they should vote in regards to this constitution, because clearly, again, given the fact that we know that the United States was heavily involved in the coup attempt that replaced the previous left-wing government led by Salvador Allende back in the 70s, we have always had a deep invested interest in maintaining our U.S. corporate control over the resources of South America, and definitely that applies to a country like Chile. So now I want to get into a little bit of the history of the U.S. relationship with this country and why some articles like the Washington Post here would be so invested in the outcome of a new constitution like this to replace, again, the one that was written by a straight-up fascist dictator who was partially installed by the United States government. So a little bit of background on that. They say American corporations, here from The Intercept, and the U.S. government have enthusiastically meddled in Chilean politics for centuries, but our involvement intensified during the 50s and 60s, and in particular, successive U.S. administrations were anxious to prevent Salvador Allende, a popular socialist politician, from being elected president. And after Allende narrowly lost the 1958 contest to the conservative, wealthy Jorge Alessandri, the U.S. spent heavily to support Alessandri's government. And when Allende ran again in the next election in 1964, the U.S. successfully went all out to stop him from winning, with a huge investment of funds funneled into Chilean politics via the CIA and the U.S. Agency for International Development, the USAID program. And they say that, but Allende ran for president again in 1970, and on September 4th of that year, the worst nightmare of the U.S. came to pass. He won. And the Nixon administration was desperate to prevent him from taking office, and their panic can be gauged by notes taken soon afterward by Richard Helms, then the director of the CIA, and he said, quote, "1 in 10 chance perhaps, but save Chile. $10 million available, more if necessary, full-time job, best men we have, game plan, make the economy scream. So straight up saying the quiet part out loud and saying we are going to try to either sanction the government or meddle directly in their democracy or do whatever we can to put a stranglehold on their economy in order to make sure that this left-wing president does not succeed. And they say that the next day, Nixon's Secretary of State, this absolute demon here, Henry Kissinger, warned American newspaper editors of off the record that Chile could be a contagious example that would infect the U.S. allies in Europe. Okay, a contagious example, playing really into this Cold War propaganda about, like, you know, same thing that they talked about in regards to Cuba, that if you have one successful semi-leftist government or damn near a socialist government in Latin America, that could cause that to, you know, spread across the region, which in my opinion would have been an absolutely fantastic thing. But from the perspective of U.S. corporations and from the CIA and from the State Department, that's basically their worst nightmare. But they say despite this, Allende was sworn in, and Nixon and company did not give up, however, conducting an enormous covert campaign to undermine his government. And on September 11th, 1973, a military junta led by Chilean General Augusto Pinochet seized power, with Allende dying under murky circumstances in the presidential palace. And the coup does not seem to have directly been organized by the United States, but it's obvious that we created the conditions that made it possible, and the plotters knew that America wouldn't mind at all if they took over. And they said that Pinochet's new regime swiftly rounded up the troublesome Chileans, killing over 3,000 of them, and meanwhile his economic team, nicknamed the Chicago Boys due to the education many of them had received in right-wing economics at the University of Chicago, moved to restructure the Chilean economy in favor of U.S. corporations and basically pushing neoliberal austerity. Kind of ties into one of the things that Gabriel Boric was running on when he was elected just a couple years ago, saying that we will basically shatter the neoliberal control over our economy into a million pieces and deal a death blow to that economic framework. But they say that this was a success under Pinochet and that both poverty and corporate profits, Chilean and American, increased. And they say that Chile's first real constitution had been instituted in 1833 and was then replaced by a new one in 1925, but within days of taking power, Pinochet's government had begun to consider creating yet another one, and in 1980 it held a plebiscite on what it had come up with, and they said that 65% of voters approved of the new constitution, with the help, of course, of thousands of the government's secret police casting multiple ballots. So that's just a little bit of background in terms of U.S. imperial involvement in Chile, and how we basically got to the situation we are right now, with Chilean people overwhelmingly initially voting, I think it was over 80%, to reject the Augusto Pinochet era constitution that was written again by this fascist dictator who was helped, at least in part or partially installed with the help of the CIA and the US State Department. And basically voters rallied around and took to the streets and protested to get rid of this constitution. And now we're left with a situation where basically they're just trying to figure out the nuances and what could potentially be a new constitution that could be written to be supported by a majority of the Chilean people. So that's where we're at right now. It is, of course, unfortunate that they didn't vote to approve this constitution immediately, but that doesn't mean that this is the end of the road, and there's definitely still going to be protests. There's still going to be movements within Chile, hopefully led by left-wing factions, in order to pressure the government to continue fighting for a new constitution. It's definitely not a question of whether or not the Pinochet-era constitution is going to be replaced. It's really, at this point, just a matter of what are the nuanced differences going to be between the one that just got rejected and a potential new one that they could vote on in the future. And hopefully, I mean, again, reading through all of those rights that they were planning on installing in this constitution, hopefully it doesn't look too different, and Chile could potentially be a bulwark for left-wing politics in Latin America, and potentially start the era of pushing back against U.S. State Department and CIA-backed involvement in the region in suppressing left-wing movements and helping and aiding and abetting and funding and arming these right-wing fascists within Latin America.